Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to just point out that the refreshments today were donated by Care One and Sharon. They're always so good to us, so hopefully you're enjoying those. We're here with Paolo DeGregorio. One of our favorite historians is back today. He's going to be talking about marking time, the history and development of the modern day calendar. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank you. Hi. Can everybody hear me okay? Or do I need to move this closer? We'll go like that for now. It is good to see all of you here. Thanks for coming out and listening to me talk. This topic kind of came about accidentally when a different place where I sometimes give lectures asked about 2024 and specifically. Now, what is it about 2024 that's kind of unique or different? It's a leap year. That was the answer I was looking for. I mean, certainly it's a presidential election year, so we're all looking forward to that, right? It is an Olympic year, so it's a good time to go to Paris. But it is a leap year, and it is the idea of the leap year that led to this talk that we are going to dive into today, looking at the history of the modern calendar. How did our calendar come to be? Now, if we look at our calendar, we're all familiar with it. We all have it on our phone or on our watch or even maybe sometimes tacked to a wall in our house. We use the calendar every day. It kind of structures our lives. When do we go to hear me talk? When do we go to pay our taxes? It's all based on this calendar, this cycle. Well, how many days are there in the calendar? 365. 365. So a year has 365 days in it, right? Except for a year like 2024. We get a bonus day this year. Yay, 366. And why do we have that extra day in this year and usually every 4 years? It's because of a leap year. How do we get there? Why do we come around to this type of calendar system that we have? Now, our modern calendar is very much based on the sun, the solar year. Our calendar is based on the revolution of the sun, the Earth around the sun. But is that the only possible way of keeping track of time? Is that the only possible calendar system? No. We could also, and societies have and still do, use a lunar calendar based on the cycles of the moon. Now, is the solar year and the lunar year the same? No. That's where we start to have problems. And that's where we dive into our story today. So let's start by looking at those two different calendar cycles. Obviously, the one we're familiar with, the one we use most often, is the solar year. And a solar year, as we know, is 365 and a little bit. 365 days plus. That plus becomes problematic as we tell the story. We, for convenience, say that a solar year is 365 and a quarter days. Right? So we have that leap year every 4 years. In reality, however, it takes the Earth 365.2422 days to revolve around the sun. So we're not quite at 365.25. Is that a big deal? Does that matter? Does that extra like 11 minutes matter? It certainly does, and it does shape the story as we move forward. Now, here on this over here, we see the tropical year. The tropical year is how long it takes the Earth to revolve around the sun once, 365.2422 days. The common year, how we structure our calendar, is 365 days, roughly a quarter of a day short. And a leap year is 366 days, making up for that kind of gap. But we have that variability, we have those problems, we have all of this math that we have to do when figuring our calendar, and that is really where the story becomes tremendously, tremendously exciting, if you want to use that term. Now, we have the solar year. What about the moon? We have a lunar calendar. We have lunar calendars also. And the cycles of the moon don't necessarily line up with the cycles of the sun. We can see this is a lunar calendar from 2021, but it doesn't quite add up. A lunar month is roughly 29 and a half days long, roughly. So we start to have these different systems of keeping track of time, keeping track of the days, organizing our year, organizing our calendar. And that kind of becomes complex as we dive into the story itself. Now, different civilizations around the world have used different methods of keeping track of time. The Sumerians had their own calendar. The Maya had their own calendar. The Mayan calendar is really fantastic because it's a combination lunar and solar calendar that had all these different cycles on it. It was supposedly indicating the end of the world, which was supposed to be like 12 years ago. I guess they messed that up. But every civilization, every complex society does develop their own calendar system, their own way of keeping track of time, usually based on the heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon. Now, where does our calendar begin? Our Western calendar that we are so familiar with today? Well, we can look at really one of the jumping off points of Western society, Western civilization, Western history. Let's go to Rome. And we start with the emergence of Rome as an independent political entity. The earliest Roman calendars are attributed to two of the first kings of Rome. A legendary figure named Romulus may or may not have existed, but he's the one who's supposedly established Rome, names the city after himself, and is considered the first king of Rome, and his successor, a king named Numa Pompilius. We all know Numa Pompilius, right? Our favorite Roman king. In any case, it is these two men who are credited with the creation of the first Roman calendar. Now, when that first Roman calendar was devised, it was largely a lunar calendar based on the cycles of the moon. But it was a lunar calendar that had a lot of flexibility to it. And in fact, the original Roman calendar was comprised of 10 months that were each 30 or 31 days long. So if we have 10 months times 30 or 31, how many days do we end up with in a Roman year, a Roman calendar year? Not enough. About 304 total days, the way the days were distributed there. That meant that there were roughly 50 or 60 days that were unaccounted for in the Roman calendar. Now, the reason why the Roman calendar was set up like that is because the winter, what we today consider the winter months, were just kind of lumped together. There were no months there. For January and February, those didn't exist on the early Roman calendar. The year ran from March to December. In fact, what does the name December mean? The 10th month. So we go March, April, May, June, Quintilius, Sextilius, September, October, November, December. That's our 10 months in the Roman year. And we have these extra days that are floating around, these extra 50, 51 days that are floating around that were considered winter break. They were just kind of these amorphous days that didn't belong to a month. They were the winter gap in the Roman calendar. So the Roman calendar began in March, it ended in December, and then you had this, I guess, recovery time, if you want to call it that, with those 55 extra days. Now, the Romans realized they had a bunch of extra days that were kind of floating around that weren't part of the calendar. So the high priest in Rome, the chief priest in the Roman world, an office that was called the Pontifex Maximus. Today, it's one of the titles of the Roman Pope. That was the high priest in the Roman world. They had a responsibility of basically moving days around on the calendar to make sure that the lunar calendar aligned with the seasons of the year. One of the problems that emerges if you're using a lunar calendar entirely is that the seasons, the solar seasons, don't always align with the lunar calendar. So let's say we have a significant holiday that's supposed to be in spring, and it's always in spring. But if we're using a lunar calendar, the date of that holiday would always change. And sometimes it would be in what were called the winter months, and sometimes it would be called the summer months. How do we keep that balance? How do we keep track of time? That was the job of the Pontifex Maximus, to use those extra days, which were called intercalary days, days that were flexible in your calendar, to keep track, to make sure everything stayed in alignment. So we have a 10-month Roman calendar. We have a bunch of extra days that can be plopped and placed in different places as were needed. That was the basis of the Roman system. We're ignoring January and February because they didn't exist at that time. Now, how do we know this? Well, we have evidence. Here is one of the earliest Roman calendars, the earliest archaeologically attested Roman calendar. It's actually an archaeological artifact. This is a reconstruction of it, but this has been found archaeologically. And it's called the Fasti Antiatis Majoris, and it dates from the 1st century BCE. So the 1st century BC, we're talking around the year 100 BC or so. And this was a Roman calendar to keep track of the year. Now notice, you have each month coming down in a line over here. We have January and February on here. They started adopting those by this point. You have March, April, May, Quintilius, and going down the line over there. We have 13 months here. Why do we have 13 months? Because by the time the Romans had adopted January and February as days, as months of the year, there were still a bunch of extra days that were floating around. And those were stuck in that 13th month over there that was called the mensis intercalaris, the floating calendar month. And how it was supposed to work was that you had those extra days on that 13th month that could be taken and stuck in other months to keep a balance, to make sure holidays were falling at the right time of year, to make sure that market days were falling in the right time of year. The market economy actually drives a lot of the Roman calendar, because the Romans had an 8-day market cycle. So every 8th day, they had public markets across the Roman world, and you needed the calendar to align with that. So you end up having all of these calculations that have to go into play to keep everything balanced in the Roman world. This calendar was essentially a lunar calendar. We're still looking at the moon, but we are trying to keep a balance between that 8-day market cycle and the seasons of the year. So we have to move things around. We have to take days from here and stick them over there to keep that balance in play. And it was a very complex and fragile system, because what would happen if, say, the Pontifex Maximus, forgets to take that extra day out of the intercalaris and stick it over here in May? And suddenly we're off by a day going this way, or we're too many days going that way. And it was tremendously, tremendously complex. Another kind of quirk about the Roman calendar is that they didn't number their days like we think of today. They had a day that was the beginning of the month called the calends. They had a day that was the middle of the month called the ides. And then they had the various market days scattered through in. It was basically ways of counting to when the market days occurred. And that's how things were numbered. In fact, if you look at this over here, you can see the calends at the beginning. You can see the ides here in the middle. Those were the important kind of signposts in the Roman calendar as the Romans kept track of time and kept track of the days of the month. So we have this system that's well established, that is in Rome, kind of the dominant calendar in Rome for centuries. But it was a messy system that often fell out of whack because things weren't falling at the right time of year. Holidays weren't occurring when they were supposed to occur. The days of the calendar didn't line up to the cycles that were actually supposed to be happening. And that, of course, is problematic. Well, who comes along to try to solve that problem? Julius Caesar. Now, what is Julius Caesar best known for? Best known as? He's best known for his assassination, certainly. But he was best known as a general and eventually the dictator of Rome. He was a hugely successful military commander. He conquers Gaul. He establishes his dominance over the Roman world. He suppresses his rivals, and he becomes the guy in power in Rome. Now, Caesar was never a Roman emperor. So when you hear people refer to Julius Caesar as a Roman emperor, stop talking to them. They don't know what they're talking about. He was the dictator of Rome, however. He was the ruler of Rome, the man with all the power. And here we have Julius Caesar, unlimited power within the Roman world, concerned about the calendar. Why? Because by the time he came to power, the Roman calendar was about 3 months out of alignment. The lunar calendar and the solar calendar had gotten completely out of whack. So Caesar said, we need to fix this. We need to make sure that the holidays are falling at the right time of year, that we're offering the right sacrifices to the gods at the right time of year. So he begins to confer with an Egyptian astronomer, a man by the name of Sosigenes of Alexandria. And Sosigenes kind of convinces Caesar to adopt the Egyptian-style calendar. Now, the Egyptians worked on a solar calendar. Why did the Egyptians work on a solar calendar? Well, because their seasons were very much tied to the ebb and flow of the Nile River. And the Nile River flooded consistently at the same time of year in the same solar season. They planted and harvested at the same time. So that dominated life in Egypt. the sun, the solar calendar, was the important calendar in Egypt. So now you have Caesar taking this solar calendar and imposing it on the Roman world. Now, Sosigenes, the Alexandrian astronomer, had calculated the length of a solar year. He said that a solar year was 365 and a quarter days in length. Sounds pretty familiar, right? That's not bad. He was off by 11 minutes. He made the day 11 minutes too long, and that would, of course, have consequences later on. So what we see is that Caesar undertakes this process of remaking the Roman calendar, pinning it to an Egyptian, modeling it after an Egyptian solar calendar, and insisting that January 1st becomes the first day of the year. What had been the first day of the year? March 1st, because remember, January and February hadn't existed for very long. So what we see is that January 1st becomes the first day of Julius Caesar's calendar. Now, we still have that problem with fractions, that quarter of a day. So what we see under the Julian calendar is that every 4 years, a leap day would be added to the calendar. Now, today, when do we stick that leap day? February 29th. Under the Roman Julian calendar, rather than adding an extra day to the end of February, what they did was they repeated February 23rd. So you'd wake up Tuesday morning, February 23rd, you'd go through your day, you'd go to sleep, and you'd wake up on Wednesday, February 23rd. So they repeated the 23rd, they didn't add the 29th. But it was a leap day added every 4th year to kind of create a balance in that solar calendar with what was happening on the ground. Now, when Caesar institutes this new calendar in the year 46 BCE, he kind of had to mess around with the numbers. And in fact, the year 46 BCE ends up lasting for 445 days, so that you could get an alignment between January 1st, the first day of the solar year, and March 1st, the first day of the lunar year, so that they would occur at the same time and we could just start counting from there. Coincidentally, the year 46 BCE is also one of the years in which Caesar was elected to a one-term office as a consul. So he extends the year by 80 days. He stays in office for 80 days longer, but he does align the calendars. So what we see is that this system begins with Julius Caesar, this reconfiguring of the calendar system, this alignment of the solar and lunar calendar in the year beginning on January 1st. Well, what happens to Caesar famously or infamously on the Ides of March in 44 BCE? He's assassinated in the Senate. The Ides of March, the middle of March, essentially March 15th. Now, after Caesar's death, the Roman Senate proposed that the 7th month of the year should be named in honor of Julius Caesar. Now, what's the 7th month of the year? July. Where do we get the name July? From Julius Caesar, and he having the gall to die, I guess. So Caesar creates a whole new calendar for the Roman world, for the Roman Empire. It becomes the calendar that is adopted and implemented throughout Roman territory. Now, when Caesar's assassinated, what happens? How many of you remember your Shakespeare? Yeah.
Doesn't Antony become president?
Well, Antony, who was one of Caesar's closest generals, certainly becomes a powerful figure in the Roman world. But another figure emerges, Caesar's adopted son, whose name was Octavian. Octavian and Antony set out to seek revenge for Caesar's assassination. They go and they kill all the conspirators and hunt them down. And eventually they establish themselves as the power in the Roman world. Antony falls in love with Cleopatra in Egypt, and that causes turmoil. Eventually, Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra, and Octavian becomes the power in the Roman world. Now, when he does that, he's firmly in control, following in Caesar's footsteps. He is given an honorary title by the Senate. He is given the title of imperator. He is given the power to command. He becomes the first Roman emperor. And he's also given a new name by the Senate, Augustus. So it's Augustus, the heir of Caesar, who becomes the first emperor of the Roman world, the first emperor of Rome. He achieves that in about 30 BCE, and he will reign for about 44 years. So he becomes kind of the next guy in charge of Rome, and he is the heir to Caesar and Caesar's calendar. Now, what we begin to see is that under Caesar's calendar, we still had the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest, whose job it was to kind of announce whenever we were going to add an extra day to the year. When are we going to have February 23rd again? And it was supposed to be every 4 years. But the Pontifex Maximus, the head priests in Rome, start to miscalculate. And instead of doing it every 4th year, they start implementing that extra day every 3rd year. Oh, so what does that mean? It means that suddenly the calendar that had been configured and used equations to kind of balance it, to keep everything in line, is out of whack again. And in fact, what occurs is that by the time we get to the year 8 BCE or so, the calendar's out of whack. It is days off of where it's supposed to be because extra days had been added and days that were supposed to be added hadn't been added, and you have this mess of a problem with the calendar. So by that point, Augustus has the title of Pontifex Maximus. He's the emperor, he's the Augustus, he's Pontifex Maximus. And what does he decide to do? We're going to stop adding days until we get everything back in line. So you go from about 8 BCE to about the year 8, where there were no extra days added to the calendar to try to bring everything back into alignment. So the Romans, in a lot of ways, make a mess of the calendar. By adding days, taking away days, changing days, let's add a month here and take a month away from there. They have this entire problem going on. Now, by the time we get to 8 BCE, when Augustus is Pontifex Maximus, when he stops adding days to the calendar for a set period of years, that 16-year period, the Senate, which at this point was more of a symbolic body than one with any power, decides to name a month in honor of Augustus. There we get August. So Julius Caesar in August then brings us to September, the 7th month, which is actually now the 9th month of the year, because why not? So it is after the reign of Augustus, as emperor, as Pontifex Maximus, dealing with this kind of miscounting of the days, that the Romans finally get their Julian calendar working. Things seem to be functioning now, and everything is good in the Roman Empire, at least in terms of the calendar. Things are working as they are supposed to. We have that extra 11 minutes. We'll deal with that later on. But by and large, things seem to be working in the Roman Empire and in the Roman calendar like they are supposed to do. Well, problems do start to arise. By the time we get to the 3rd and the 4th century, there is a new religious sect coming out of the Eastern Mediterranean that is gaining popularity in the Roman world, and that eventually will become the official religion, the state religion of the Roman Empire. That is Christianity. When Christianity emerges as a powerful entity within the Roman world, we'll say roughly around 380 when it's legalized in the Roman Empire and becomes the state religion, a whole set of problems do emerge. Because now what we need to do is take the important Christian holidays, particularly Easter, the most important day on the Christian calendar, and figure out how to align that with the Roman solar calendar. The Roman calendar was the calendar, yet the Easter holiday is based on a lunar cycle. So what are we going to do? How are we going to figure out how to calculate the proper time for when Easter, the most important holiday in the Christian calendar, is going to be celebrated? How is it going to fit into this Roman calendar? Have you ever wondered why Easter is never on the same day? You know, Christmas, December 25th, great. Easter could be in March, could be in April, could be wherever. And there's a reason for that. It's because Easter is based on a lunar calendar. Christmas is a made-up holiday that they just stuck at the end of the year. So what we end up with during this early Christian period is that lots of different people are trying to figure out how do we calculate the date of Easter. You have different astronomers in different parts of the Roman Empire, in Alexandria, in Rome, in the Eastern Mediterranean, figuring and trying to calculate the set date for Easter. How do we know the date of Easter? How does that figure? Anybody know the formula for figuring out when Easter falls? There's a difference between the Orthodox date for Easter and the Western Roman Catholic date for Easter. It all has to do with lunar cycles, though, and the lunar calendar. Easter is supposed to always occur on the first Sunday after the Paschal full moon, What is the Paschal full moon? It is the first full moon that occurs on or after the spring equinox, which is usually March 21st. So, we have to figure out when the first full moon after after the equinox is, and then we calculate to find out the date of Easter. There is also the problem of Passover. How do we align Easter with Passover? Because in the biblical story, the Easter events take place during the Passover celebration. So you have the problems, the difficulties of aligning all of that. This becomes a hugely divisive issue in the early Christian church in the Roman Empire, as different parts of the Roman Empire, based on these different schools, have their own idea of when Easter should occur. So you have all of this turmoil, you have all of this competition, all of these scholars proposing different dates for Easter. This is problematic because it's the holiest day in the year. How do we not know when this date actually is? Well, what are we going to do? Aside from fighting and arguing and having church councils and that sort of stuff, eventually this man comes along. Dionysius Exiguus. Anybody know him? Dionysius Exiguus is an interesting figure. First of all, his first name is that of the Roman god of drink. So he's named after a pagan god, yet he plays an important role in determining the destiny of the Christian church. This last word, Exiguus, there actually means the humble. So he's Dionysius the Humble. He will play a gigantic role in shaping the calendar as we know it today. Now, one of the things that Dionysius Exiguus does is he begins to create a table to calculate when Easter will fall. He creates a 17-year cycle to lay out and predict when Easter will occur in that 17-year cycle. I'll show you a picture of that Paschal calendar in a minute. He also becomes one of the earliest people to adopt this phrasing for counting years. Anno Domini Nostri Jesu Christi. The year of our Lord, our Jesus Christ. Now, why is that important? Anno Domini, AD. He begins to count time from the calculated date of the birth of Jesus. Now, he miscalculates that date. But he says, you know what? We are starting to count our calendar using this Paschal calendar, using the Julian calendar from the date of the birth of Jesus. We'll call that the year 1. Again, he was probably off by about 4 years there. How had Christians been keeping track of time and counting the years prior to this, prior to the 5th century? They had actually been counting from the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Now, why from the reign of Diocletian? Because that was when you had the first systematic, far-spread persecutions of the Christians. That was called the Age of the Martyrs. So the Christians, after Diocletian, started counting time from the reign of Diocletian. It is Dionysius Exiguus who says, no, we're going to count from the birth of Jesus. This is when I figure that is. And he starts labeling things AD to promote that idea. He creates this Paschal calendar. This is in a church in Ravenna, Italy, dating from the 6th century, that it lays out the Easter cycle and determines when Easter falls on which day during that 17-year cycle. Not the easiest thing to comprehend, particularly if you don't read early medieval Latin, but it is laid out and it does systematize how to determine the date of Easter. Now, this is a gigantic innovation because what we see is that this Paschal calendar created by Dionysius Exiguus becomes the one that is accepted across much of the Christian world, much of the Roman world. It becomes the standard that Alexandria and Rome and many other cities adopt to calculate the date of Easter. This calendar has a further boost in its reputation because of the work of the Venerable Bede. Anybody know the Venerable Bede? I'm going to try to change my name to the Venerable. But the Venerable Bede was an English churchman in the 7th century, 7th and 8th century. And he is perhaps one of the most important figures in the history of Christianity in England. He writes a celebrated history of the English people. He does all sorts of scientific and philosophical inquiry. And perhaps his most significant achievement, other than that history of the English people, is that he adopts and supports the Paschal table that was created by Dionysius Exiguus. He popularizes it. He also becomes one of the first people to popularize the use of AD dating. Because of Bede's importance in England and in Europe itself, that system of calculating the date of Easter, that system of keeping time, becomes tremendously, tremendously important. We enter into the Anno Domini cycle of counting our years because Dionysius Exiguus comes up with it and the Bede popularizes it. And that is how we kind of end up knowing what year we're in now. Because these two men in the 5th and 6th centuries, 6th and 7th centuries, create this cycle of keeping track of Easter and counting from the supposed birth of Jesus to keep track of our years. So once this has been established, once the Dionysian system becomes popular because of the works of the Venerable Bede, suddenly we seem to have calendar stability across much of Europe. Now, as Christian Europe grows and as the influence of the Roman Empire ceases, one change that the Christians do make is that they change the beginning of the year back to March. They move it away from January 1st and it goes back to March. So the calendar year began in March. Why do they do that? Because that January date was tied too much to Roman mythology, to Roman paganism. So they said, we're going back to the traditional date of March as the beginning of the year, not January. But the 12-month cycle of 30 or 31-day months remains intact, and that Julian calendar does continue on. Now, what we see during the Middle Ages, during the medieval period, is that calendars emerge in a wide variety of forms. It's not that standard grid that we are familiar with today. Here you see some examples of different medieval calendars, keeping track of the months and the activities that occur in that month, planting and harvesting and sitting by the fire, all that sort of stuff. Illustrations to show the saints' days on this one over here. There you have one that's tied to the celestial cycles of the stars, kind of the symbols of the zodiac. That one over there, I don't know what's going on that one, but you have some fantastic imagery, religious imagery decorating the calendar sheaf itself. So what we see during the medieval period, after the 7th and 8th century, is that we have a standardized calendar. It is based on that Julian calendar. We've moved the start of the year to March, but more or less things seem to be working along okay. And these medieval scholars and monks and wealthy noblemen across Europe are commissioning calendars that look like this. Now, perhaps one of the most important series of medieval calendars is this book, the Tradition du Duc de Berry. The Duc de Berry was a tremendously wealthy and influential French nobleman. And in the early 15th century, he commissioned the Limbourg brothers to create a calendar and a book of prayers. So it's a complex work. You have calendar pages like this showing the different seasons of the year, the solar cycles up there. And you had prayer pages with prayers written in them and psalms and that sort of thing. A massive work. But these are celebrated fancy calendars from the early 15th century. In the images, you see the cycles of the year depicted by what the pictures are showing. This one in the middle is January. And what do we see going on there in January but a feast? A feast. The Duke is this guy right there with the fur hat and the blue robe, sitting at his feast table. Then you have scenes of the springtime there where we're planting the crops. And here you have the wintertime where the peasants are hanging out in their house, trying to keep warm. The pigs and the pigeons are all there in the barnyard. So each month had a season that went with it, had events that went with it, again, tied to that solar calendar. Yet we still have the cycles of these stars and the planets up above. So this is the system that we have going into the Middle Ages, going into the early modern period. That Julian calendar created by Julius Caesar and his Alexandrian astronomer is what's in place. That is the thing that is guiding how we figure out the time of the year and the day of the year and that sort of thing. And it seems to be okay, but we do have a problem. By the time we get to the 16th century, those extra 11 minutes on each day in that Julian calendar start to pile up, and they start to kick the calendar out of whack, out of alignment. And in fact, by the time we get to the papacy of Gregory the 13th, the Julian calendar was about 10 days out of cycle. It had moved 10 days ahead because of those extra 11 minutes each day. So now we have a problem. We have a problem because the calendar is starting to get out of whack. It's starting to become difficult to calculate the date of Easter, which seems to be the driving factor in a lot of this. Other events are not aligning where they're supposed to in the solar calendar, in the seasonal calendar. So we have issues. Now, this question of what to do with the calendar had actually been taken up by a church council in the 1540s, the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent had suggested that the calendar needed to be realigned. It takes about 40 years before Gregory the 13th here actually sets about the process to realign the calendar. He creates a commission of church scholars to begin investigating how do we fix this. Church astronomers, church scientists, looking at the ancient texts, looking at the calendar systems at play to work on how do we fix the calendar, the misalignment of the calendar that we have right now. There are two people that become hugely important in developing this new calendar, the so-called Gregorian calendar. One of them was an Italian mathematician. This man over here, the French version of his name is Aloysius Lilius. His Italian name is Luigi Giglio, but he's known as Lilius for some reason. He becomes the primary author of what becomes the Gregorian calendar. He looks at the mathematics, he looks at the planetary alignment, and he devises a new system to correct the Julian calendar. Eventually, Lilius's work is picked up by this man here, Christopher Clavius, who was the head of the papal commission to redesign the calendar. Clavius bases his work on Lilius, modifies it a little bit, and then proposes this new calendar system. And it is that system created by Clavius based on the works of Lilius that becomes the Gregorian calendar. Now, what does the Gregorian calendar have to deal with? Has to deal with the fact that the calendar year is not exactly 365.25 days in length, and it has to deal with the fact that the Julian calendar is 10 days out of alignment. So what we see is this commission comes back with the report. They propose a new calendar, and the Pope, Gregory, in February of 1582, issues a papal bull, a papal declaration called Inter Gravissimas. Many papal bulls are known by the first couple of words of the document itself. And Inter Gravissimas begins with saying it is of the deepest, most serious concern of the church to fix the alignment of the calendar because we're falling out of whack on the holidays. So in February of 1582, Inter Gravissimas is issued by the Pope, Gregory the 13th, saying in October we are implementing this new calendar. Now, we have a bunch of days we have to deal with, extra days. So what are we going to do? By papal decree, the couple of days, 10 days in the middle of October are going to be erased. And what we see is that when the Gregorian calendar goes into effect in October of 1582, Thursday, October 4th, was followed immediately by Friday, October 15th. If your birthday was somewhere in that week, sorry, you missed out this year. So we had to get things into alignment. We erased 10 days from the calendar. Also, January 1st was reinstituted as the first day of the year. So this decree, this papal bull is issued October 1582 as a short month because 10 days are erased, but the Gregorian calendar goes into operation. The Gregorian calendar is immediately adopted, becomes the calendar for all of Catholic Europe. All of the Catholic states adopt the Gregorian calendar proposed by the Roman Catholic priest. So, Roman Catholic Pope. That has political overtones, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, what is one of the things that the Gregorian calendar tries to correct from the Julian calendar? Well, it had to do with those extra 11 minutes every year. How are we going to fix it so that the calendar doesn't get entirely out of whack, so that what we have on the wall is not different than what the sun is telling us the season of the year is? Well, we are going to institute a complex system of leap years. We have a leap year hopscotch over here. We have a leap year flowchart, which we'll take a look at. Essentially, what happens in the Gregorian calendar, and I'm going to have to read my notes here because I can never keep track of this in my head, is that 3 out of every 4 centennial years should be common years, meaning they should have a leap year. They should not have a leap year. So if it's a century, 1700, 1800, 1900, it does not have a leap year. So that's a 365-day year, although it is a 4th year. We're skipping the leap year on those days. However, every century that is divisible by 400, is a leap year. So 2000 was a leap year, but 1900 was not. So we can kind of look at the flow chart over there. Yes, that's the system we have. That is because we have those extra 11 minutes that if we let them go too far, will knock the calendar out of alignment. So if we have a year, it asks, is the year evenly divisible by 4? If it's not a leap year. That's easy. If it is, we then have to go, is the year divisible by 100? If it is, if it's not, then it's not a leap year. If it is, then we go, is the year evenly divisible by 400? And then we can determine whether or not we have a leap year. It is not a simple system. So we have to keep that in mind as we are looking at the leap year and trying to figure out, do we have an extra day this year, this century, this millennium, or not? So this is the system that is created to keep that balance between the solar year and the actual events going on the planet and keep everything in line and deal with those extra 11 minutes that are floating around somewhere. So this is instituted by Gregory the 13th. Now, what's going on in Europe during this time, the 16th and 17th centuries? We are in the midst of the Reformation. You have a lot of parts of Europe that have broken away from the Catholic Church, that have said the Pope's not the head of the church. We don't believe in the church in Rome. We have our own ideas about what Christianity should be. And that complicates the calendar situation because the Catholic states, Spain, Portugal, Italy, much of France, they adopt the Gregorian calendar right away. They have no choice. That becomes the standard calendar for those parts of Europe. But those Protestant states, places like England and parts of Germany, don't adopt the Gregorian calendar. And the states that are Orthodox Christian have no need for the Gregorian calendar. So what we end up with are different calendar systems running across Europe. And that becomes tremendously complicated. Now, it does have to be said that the Gregorian calendar is gradually adopted by many of the Protestant states because of trade, because of commerce, because of record keeping. A lot of the Protestant states on the European continent do gradually, one by one, adopt the Gregorian calendar. One kingdom, however, is a holdout and is kind of slow in adopting that Gregorian calendar. That is England. England. Why does England resist adopting the Gregorian calendar? Well, the English dislike the Catholics, the Catholic Church. There's a lot of religious struggle going on there from Henry VIII, who wanted a divorce, through the struggles of his children to maintain religion there. You have all sorts of turmoil in the 17th century with the Stuarts and whether or not the Stuart kings were Catholic or closet Catholics and that sort of stuff. There's a long, complex history in England with the church, the Catholic Church, and the Protestants in England. Incidentally, that depiction over there on the lower right is how the Protestants perceived the Pope. It's not a flattering image. It's this monstrous creature with the face of a devil and another devil kind of in his chest, wearing a papal tiara. So we know that the Protestants were not keen on doing anything that would be friendly to the Catholic Church. But you have this turmoil, you have the establishment of the Gregorian calendar, eventually, slowly, gradually adopted by many of those European continental Protestant powers. But England is a holdout. England will refuse to adopt the Gregorian calendar for years and years and years. And in fact, it isn't until the reign of George II in the early 18th century, early and mid 18th century, that England finally modernizes their calendar. In 1750, a piece of legislation makes its way through Parliament that's called the Calendar Act of 1750. And what that called for was England and the British Empire to adopt the Gregorian calendar, a calendar that had been adopted by the bulk of Western Europe by that point. So the English were doing their own thing. They had a separate calendar than the French did. Just another thing for the English and the French to fight over, I guess. But eventually, this piece of legislation does win royal approval, and in September of 1752, the Gregorian calendar goes into effect in England. But wait a second. The Julian calendar that had been the calendar in England is now 11 days ahead. So what are we going to do? We're going to erase a bunch of days. And what we see in September of 1752 in England is that Wednesday, September 2nd, was followed immediately by Thursday, September 14th. You lose a bunch of days there. Now, when this goes into effect, when this Georgian Gregorian calendar goes into effect in England, it also affected all of the global empire, the British Empire around the world, which means that here in the British colonies in North America, we went to sleep on September 2nd and woke up on September 14th. Now, if you are a historian of the British world during this time period, the decades prior to 1750, reading historical documents can be fun, particularly if they come from the early part of the year, January, February, March, because under the Julian calendar, March was the beginning of the year. So if you find documents, let's say a will that was signed in January of 1748, it will say January 1748/49. It'll have 2 years listed there. And it becomes a real headache for doing primary document research in the early British colonies during this period of the British Empire. In any case, eventually Britain does catch up. They do get in line. They do adopt the Gregorian calendar there in 1752. And what we see is that when Britain adopts the Gregorian calendar, so does all of this. The British Empire at its height all has the Gregorian calendar imposed on it, from Canada all the way out to New Zealand. This becomes the main calendar because the British conquer all of that territory, and the British imposing this calendar throughout their empire essentially means that the Gregorian calendar becomes the dominant calendar system around the world. It is the one that becomes the modern global calendar. Now, is that the end of our story? No, of course not. Because calendars are endlessly fascinating and history is endlessly complex, what we do see are challenges to the Gregorian calendar system in Europe in the 18th century. Where? Well, why not France? Because what goes on in France at the end of the 18th century? A revolution. The French overthrow the monarchy. They try to overthrow the power of the church. And in creating the French Revolution and the First French Republic, the revolutionaries are trying to break with the Ancien Regime, with the old system of government. They've gotten rid of the king. Louis XVI gets his head chopped off. We need something else. We don't want to be tied to this calendar that was created by a pope who is the head of the church. So the French revolutionaries create their own revolutionary calendar. Here we see scenes of the toppling. There's some heads on pikes and stuff like that. The French Revolution is it's a big deal. It upends a lot of systems. So the French revolutionaries create a revolutionary calendar. A revolutionary calendar that begins in September of 1793. Why? The first date of the declaration of the First French Republic. That becomes the starting point for the French Revolutionary calendar. So, the year 1792 is considered year one in the French Revolutionary calendar. We are now in year 232 in the French Revolutionary calendar. The names of the months are changed into various flora and fauna that are found within France. So you have 4 seasons divided into 3 equal months that are named after French natural characteristics. This becomes the French Revolutionary calendar during the early part of the French Revolution, really up until the reign of Napoleon I. When Napoleon becomes emperor in 1804, he kind of changes it back to the old system. Gets rid of this revolutionary calendar because Napoleon is trying to get in good with the church, so he has to institute some of those changes. But the French, during the Revolution, tried to create their own new calendar. Short-lived. still referred to sometimes, but this was it. So after Napoleon, the French are aligned with the Gregorian calendar, as is much of the rest of the world at this point, and things seem to be moving along quite fine. There are a couple of holdouts still, however, and one of them is a vast empire in Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire. Why is the Russian Empire, has it not adopted the Gregorian calendar? Because of religion. The Russian Empire was Russian Orthodox, and they still maintained the Julian calendar. So as long as the Russian Empire existed and the czars were ruling over Russia, it was the Julian calendar that was the calendar in the Russian Empire and its territories. The rest of Europe had adopted the Gregorian calendar. So you have this division between the two religions, and one country, one empire going its own way, and everybody else kind of doing the standard thing. Well, when does that change in Russia? The Russian Revolution. 1917, 1918, when the Tsar is overthrown and a communist socialist regime is implemented. The revolution, of course, led by Vladimir Lenin over there. And here we see some more Lenin doing some Lenin stuff. And what occurs is that a revolutionary commission, in the wake of this revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar, in January of 1918, issues a decree saying that Russia will now adopt the Gregorian calendar. So by decree, by this revolutionary commission, Russia in 1918 adopts the Gregorian calendar. Now we're going to have a problem. Yeah, because the Julian calendar had a couple of extra days laying around. In fact, it was about 13 days out of whack at this point. So what we see in Russia is that January 31st, 1918, was followed immediately by Valentine's Day, February 14th. We got rid of the first 2 weeks of February in 1918 in Russia to bring everything up to alignment, and the Gregorian calendar is instituted in Russia. Now, if you are a student of the Russian Revolution, does this cause problems? Yeah, because the revolution in Russia that overthrows the Tsar is often referred to as the October Revolution in the Julian calendar. The October Revolution in Russia took place in November on the Gregorian calendar. So you have that October Revolution, which was actually taking place in November of 1918 in the Gregorian calendar. I always get a lot of blank looks when I teach this to my students. The October Revolution was in November. But you do have that because of that shift in dating. Oftentimes the Julian calendar was referred to as old style. The Gregorian calendar was referred to as new style. And it does make the history lots and lots of fun. So by the time we get to the early 20th century and the collapse of the Russian Empire and the emergence of what becomes the Soviet Union, most countries around the world have finally aligned their calendars to adopt the Gregorian calendar that was created by a Renaissance pope based on the miscalculations of a Roman general in the 1st century BCE. A lot of the world is brought into this Gregorian calendar because of a Protestant German British king in the early 18th century. And what do we have? Well, eventually the Gregorian calendar does become the standard calendar mostly around the world. This map shows us when different countries around the world adopted the Gregorian calendar. It also tells us by color how many days they had to drop in order to get the thing to work. Now notice the United States and Canada adopt the Gregorian calendar in 1752. Why? Because they were part of the British Empire. But if you look, Alaska isn't until 1867. Now wait a second. Why is that? It was Russian until 1867 when the United States buys it. So in Alaska, prior to the signing of that treaty, the people in Alaska were under the Julian calendar. The treaty is signed, and suddenly it's the Gregorian calendar that becomes the thing that's regulating their time. What we see, however, is that the Gregorian calendar does spread around the world. It is adopted as the main secular calendar around the world. This is the calendar of business. This is the calendar of diplomacy. Is it the only calendar in operation? No. There are certain religious calendars that are still in operation around the world. There are philosophical calendars that are in operation around the world. There are some societies that don't have calendars at all that are still based on the seasons and the time of the year. So the Gregorian calendar does emerge as the dominant calendar system, the secular calendar system around the world. It has a long, complex sometimes controversial history, adding days, taking days away. Maybe we'll add days, maybe we won't. We'll do some math determining if we have leap years and stuff. But it does become the calendar system that most people around the world do acknowledge for their daily lives and for their conduct of business. And that is the story of a Roman general, a Renaissance pope, and a British king, and how they shaped our concept of time. Does anybody have any questions?
How did the Orthodox become involved with the lunar calendar?
The lunar calendar is kind of the first calendar that is broadly adopted, and that was, the early Roman calendar was a lunar calendar. It just the Julian calendar is kind of trying to regulate that sort of stuff, and the Orthodox still follow the Julian calendar. So because they were part of the Roman Empire and the Roman world, it was the Julian calendar that predominated. The Orthodox Church and the Western Church separate in the 11th century, in 1054. So at that time, they were both on the same calendar system. But in the West, with the popes in Rome and Gregory, they adopt the Gregorian calendar. They don't do that in the Orthodox world. So you have that misalignment. And one of the things that the date between Western Christian Easter and Orthodox Easter shifts all the time. Every 17 years, they align on the same day because you have that 17-year cycle. But it's the lunar calendar and the solar calendar and how to figure all that out. All of those tables of computations that we looked at. Yes, go ahead.
No, you tell a marvelous story.
Thank you.
The story really isn't over. Isn't it true that the calendar is still not exactly right and they need more adjustments?
It is not exactly right because it would be very, very difficult to align it. One of the reasons why we have kind of that funkiness with the centennial years and the 400, divisible by 400, is to try to keep it in balance so that it doesn't get too far out of whack. So it might get ahead, but then you pull it back, and then it gets ahead, and then you pull it back. So it's basically a balancing act back and forth. Now, most of us won't be greatly affected by that unless you plan on living for 600 years. But it does have an impact on the bigger stage, the bigger scale.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes. How do they decide how many days are in the month? A lot of that was tradition. The Romans had 30 or 31 days, again, based on those market cycles they had, based on kind of the seasons of the year. That was pretty much the standard. Now, the lunar calendar, as I said, was about 29 days. So you do have that difference that had to be compensated for, that had to be jiggered with, for lack of a better term. But it was standard 30 or 31 days. February always gets kind of abused by that, and people are taking days out of February to stick them someplace else. But it was essentially playing around with the numbers. Yes, go ahead. By my understanding, the earliest calendars, the Sumerians, the Maya, all of those early civilizations were very, very skilled astronomers. They watched the skies, they knew where things were. They had a very, very good concept of the movement of the planets and the stars and stuff like that. And they based their calculations based on their observations. So looking at the cycles of the moon, one society, one culture would say, okay, we're going to use that, the new moon to new moon or full moon to full moon, however. Others would look at the sun and how the sun and the seasons impacted the growing and the society here. So it was basically by observation of what was visible to the people that were making those calculations. It might not necessarily have been tied to the stars per se, but certainly the moon and the sun. Like Stonehenge, people say Stonehenge is aligned to the equinox. That was something that was observable, an observable event. So people would have aligned things. A lot of medieval churches are aligned with the equinox. So during the spring equinox, rays of light come in through the main window and kind of illuminate the interior of the church. You had a question.
Yeah. How confusing must that be for historians to go back through documents and artifacts and try to figure out exactly what date, so do they do like the current time scheme when they're dating artifacts, or like if there's a separate date on the artifact?
It's usually when we
Document, do they tweak it to current time?
it depends on how the if you're writing a history, how you want to approach it. If you're talking about something that's in the Julian calendar, you might want to stick with the Julian dating system. But if you want to make it kind of modernize it, you can take those Julian dates because you can calculate the difference and say, that was happening during this date. In general terms, historians basically talk in big numbers. So if you're saying, it was the year 1540, 1540 is kind of gives you a ballpark of when that was. Again, it is up to the individual historian. It's up to convention. It is up to the area of study. So if you're studying pre-revolutionary Russia, you're probably going to be dealing mostly with the Julian dates. If you're studying the Russian Revolution, you're dealing with both of them. So it just depends on kind of what your school of inquiry is.
I wonder if we'll have a new calendar.
Hopefully not, because I don't want to think about the calculations.
So when was it decided to change from BC and AD to CE, Common Era, and before BCE?
That is kind of a shift that occurs gradually, probably the late 1980s going to the early 90s, as a way of being somewhat more inclusive. Because we have to remember that many people who use the Gregorian calendar system are not tied to Christianity at all. It was a very Christnocentric calendar when it was developed, when it first begins to spread, but it's still in use in places that are not predominantly Christian. So how do you fix that? You kind of remove that idea of, BC and AD out of it and just reterm it. It's the exact same dating system, the exact same thing. It's just called differently. Yes?
I was wondering how far back in antiquity they're able to measure that the calendar was off by 11 minutes.
That is, I don't think the ancient astronomers realized they were off by 11 minutes. We have to remember that sort of precision with time is a relatively modern phenomenon. People didn't have watches, didn't have clocks. Mechanical clocks aren't invented until like the 13th or 14th century. So that 11 minutes wasn't considered a big interval. So, the ancient astronomers were really, really good at a lot of things. They estimated the circumference of the world within like a couple of 100 miles from ancient Greece, just looking at the curve of the horizon. They understood the movement of the stars. They could predict when there were going to be eclipses and that sort of thing, when comets were going to come by. But the precision that we today expect with science wasn't something that existed until relatively recently.
Also, to follow up my question,
Sure.
what year do you think somebody first said it was off by 11 minutes?
That is a good question. Probably when people started realizing that there was a misalignment between dates and seasons, they said, well, there's got to be some sort of something that's off. I don't know when they actually made the calculation of 365.2422, rather than just rounding it to the 0.25, but it must have had to do with some, I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably scientific revolution. Somebody like Copernicus or Galileo may have had an inkling of that. But again, it depended on having good modes of keeping time. You had to have a mechanical clock. So yeah, 1600s would probably be my guess, but again, that's kind of a ballpark. Yes?
Brings us back to this thing now where all those guys that were the astronomers, the scientists, they were all men because women weren't doing anything. Thank God they had women at home.
Well, you have to consider that, when you look at the history books, you have all of these great men who are going off on expeditions and sailing around the world and creating all these things. They couldn't have done any of that without somebody taking care of them, basically. And though the wives, the women may have not, their names might not have been recorded, or they might not have been the center of the story, they were certainly equally as important in a lot of that achievement. So, you have people like Einstein who was a genius, but I think his wife typed up all his work. So go ahead. Yes. Right. November. Yeah. All the rest of 31, except for February. Yeah. Okay, one last question, and then I'll stick around if you want to talk afterwards. Nobody ever does. Does anybody know what time it is? We'll go with some Chicago on the way out, right? We'll play some. All right, well, thanks a lot. I hope you found that enjoyable, and I will see you next time.